Hi everyone, Ian here, and in today's video I'll be showing you how to use the Gio Scopes, and I'll cover some of the additional new features which have recently become available in the latest firmware update for the RED Komodo. Now, Gio Scopes have been around in other RED cameras for a number of years, so it's great to see that these have finally been added to the Komodo, because they're an incredibly powerful exposure tool, which has been designed to perfectly work with the camera's sensor and dynamic range. So, what are Gio Scopes? Well, essentially, they're a variation on the more common false color tool, which allows the operator to look directly at the exposure and dynamic range available within a scene from the perspective of the sensor's raw data. This is designed to help ensure you don't crush or clip any areas of the frame. Gio Scopes are not affected by the ISO changes you make or the LUTs you've overlaid, and this is because the ISO in RED cameras doesn't affect how much dynamic range is present. Instead, it uses a floating scale for where the dynamic range sits across the entire tonal range. And RED propose that the Gio Scopes can be seen as a substitute for the traditional camera light meter. And in many ways, I see the Gio Scopes as a digital version of the classic spot meter and Ansel Adams zone exposure system. The new Gio Scopes are available via the monitoring tools page within the false color tab. When false color is enabled, you then need to set your mode to Gio Scopes. Once set, the Gio Scopes tab will become available, and within here you can turn on each individual stop of dynamic range. This means you have full control and adjustability as to which light levels you're viewing. Now, you can also access the Gio Scopes via the quick function buttons, and to do this, tap on the traffic light indicators, then select the Tools tab, and then once again navigate to False Color, select Enable, and turn on the Gio Scopes. Once enabled, these can be quickly turned on and off via the Gio Scope selector. However, just be aware that if you want to turn on different stops of light, you'll need to go back into that monitoring tool selection page and use the Gio Scope dropdown. When enabled, this will present the user with a monochrome image, and each number, i.e. stop of dynamic range, will have a unique color assigned to it. And when the user has selected that number via the Gio Scope dropdown, the color will become visible across areas of the image of which the stop of dynamic range is present in. And this will tell the operator that the specific area is falling within a specific brightness range. This is essentially showing us the light levels and lighting ratios across the frame. And this allows us to build where each area of the frame will sit within the camera's dynamic range. Across the Gio Scopes, RED states that number 11 represents middle grey, and 16 represents the brightest highlights within the image. However, I would always place my brightest highlights 1 or 2 stops lower than this, just to ensure that no areas are fully clipping. So on the Komodo, stop 15 is represented by the colour orange, and stop 14 is represented by the colour yellow. So let's take a look at a scene and break it down so we can fully understand how this works. So I'm currently in the RED Control app, and you'll see on the right hand side we've got the image coming from Komodo, and on the left hand side we have the control panel. Now, the image is being captured in RED RAW. However, I've placed a Rec. 709 LUT on the screen to make the image more visible for this demonstration. The Gio Scopes won't ever reference this LUT, they'll only ever reference the native RAW image. So in the control panel, we have the false color tab, and when I tap this, it'll turn on the Gio Scopes and the image will become monochrome. And you'll also see a Gio Scopes window replaces the histogram. When we tap into the Gio Scopes window, you'll see we have the individual stops of dynamic range, all represented by a different color, ranging from 1 in purple to 16 in red. This allows us to turn on our individual stops of light. Across the brightness values, middle grey sits at stop 11. So if I turn this on, and then I'll go back to the live view, you'll see that the middle grey colour appears across the frame. And as I begin to adjust the exposure, you'll see that this colour will shift across the image. This allows us to really pinpoint where we want our exposure to sit. And because there's only one colour selected within the Gio Scopes, it makes it easy to see the rest of the monochrome image, which is a complaint that people sometimes have with traditional false color scales, in which a lot of colors are present and can't be disabled. But if we go back into our Gio Scopes panel, we can turn on additional specific brightness ranges. For example, if I turn on number 1, this is looking for the darkest shadows in the frame, and areas which are very close to crushing and losing all visible information. And you'll see that initially nothing changes across the image, because there are no shadows currently sitting across that stop of light. However, when I darken my image, you'll see the color purple appears. Now, when I turn the Gio Scopes off, you'll see the image is incredibly dark, and this would be incredibly difficult and probably impossible to fix in post-production. So although there technically may be data across areas of the frame, because not every area is crushed, it doesn't mean that it's a correctly exposed image. A scene of this nature and in this environment should have areas of middle grey within it. And you'll see as I brighten the frame and turn the Gio Scopes off, we now have an acceptable image. Now, as well as these shadows, we can also enable colours for the brightest stops of light. And when I turn on number 16, you'll see as I begin to brighten the image, the sky will turn red. And this means we're close to and potentially starting to lose some visual information. And if I continue to increase the brightness, you'll see that the red will turn into black. And at this point, we're definitely losing pixel information. Now, normally, if I want to ensure that I'm not at the top end of my brightness range, I can turn on number 15, which is represented in orange. And when I see this color in the sky, it's just letting me know that I have a bit of leeway, and I'm just under the final stop of dynamic range. And this just ensures that I'm definitely retaining all of my raw sensor data. Now, I can also enable other stops across the brightness range. For example, if I wanted to see the light levels across the scene which are sitting 2 stops below middle grey, I can enable Geo 9, and we can now see this additional information. If you wanted to expose 4 Caucasian skin tones, you could enable stop 12, and for darker skin tones, a good starting point would be stop 11 and potentially stop 10. I also normally enable a value close to stop 4, just so I can see when I'm starting to capture darker shadows. This also helps me ensure that I'm not lowering my shadows too much and crushing any information. Again, across the image I can see shadows, but I can already tell that this is a poorly exposed image, because my middle grey stop of light is sitting across the sky, and a sky is normally 2 to 3 stops brighter than middle grey. So this really helps us measure our light output. Now, it's worth noting that the ISO won't have any effect on how the Gio Scopes react across your image. For example, if I change the ISO from 800 to 12,800, you'll see the colours don't shift and change locations. And that's because the ISO in RED cameras doesn't affect the raw sensor data or change how many stops of dynamic range are available to the camera. So similarly, if I go to ISO 250, again, there's no change. However, if I adjust my aperture, this will alter how the Gio Scopes interact, because when the aperture is adjusted, it's adding or removing physical light from the real world. This is also the same for ND filters, with adding or removing light from the camera, so the Gio Scopes will adjust accordingly. Again, changing the shutter speed will also change the Gio Scopes. If I move from 180 to 22.5, the image will get darker, and if I select 360, the image will get brighter. If you want the live image to be larger, you can double tap on the viewing window, and it will move to full screen. And this is great as it gives you a bigger viewing platform to explore the image and dial in your exposure. If you pinch the screen, you'll exit full view, and this will still provide a viewing area which is bigger than the default mode, but it also gives you access to a number of function parameters, the Gio Scope button being one of them. To go back to the default screen, tap the triangle in the top left-hand corner. One thing to be mindful of is that if I enable a lot of the stop values at the same time, it can sometimes make the Geoscopes overbearing and difficult to read. So I normally only have a couple of values turned on at any given time. And normally I'll always have my middle grey point turned on, I'll always have my brightest highlights enabled, and I'll have a shadow on, both the darkest shadows at number 1 to ensure I'm not crushing anything, and number 3 or 4 to ensure I can see where some shadow detail is lying. So hopefully that's given you a bit more detail as to how the Geoscopes work and why they're so useful, and also the fantastic functionality of the RED Control app. This really is one of the best implemented control apps I've used, and removed the need for an external monitor in a lot of situations. In addition to the newly added Geoscopes, we also have some other great features which have been added to the Komodo, but also some improvements in autofocus capability. In previous firmwares, the Komodo's autofocus was okay as a simple drag to focus system, and was actually quite sticky when it locked onto a subject. But I did find it hunted quite a lot, even though it's using face detection autofocus. And unlike many of its competitors in a similar price range, it lacked tracking, face detection, or eye autofocus. Well, lo and behold, in this latest firmware, we now do have face detection. And in interview scenarios in which the subject isn't moving too much, it's actually quite good. However, I will say that if your subject is moving quickly, or constantly moving back and forth, and you have a shallow depth of field, you'll probably see some hunting occurring and the camera going in and out of focus. So I still think the autofocus is best used in controlled, slower moving environments. So to set this up, we need to make sure our lens is obviously set to autofocus. Then we need to go into the menu, select autofocus, enable it, and ensure it's set to continuous. Now, the size that you pick from this tab will remain when the face detection is turned on within the RED Control app. So if you choose a small autofocus size, the autofocus will utilize a smaller box to follow the face. And if you choose a larger size, this larger size will remain when the face detection comes online. Now, as I just mentioned, you can only currently enable face detection through the RED Control app. And when in the app, you'll need to navigate to the Focus tab, then select Tools. Once selected, you should see the App Face Detect Autofocus tab. Tap this and change it from off to first, and the face autofocus will automatically engage. One thing to be aware of, at least in this current iteration of the face detection, is that if your face moves out of frame, although the Komodo is set to continuous AF, it won't try and readjust its focus to what it deems as most important within the frame. Instead, it will remain out of focus until another face is reintroduced. If you want the focus to readjust, you'll either need to tap the screen on the Komodo, or tap the live feed on the app, or press AF Start. One of the most notable updates is the new R3D ELQ compression option, which sits below the original LQ option. RED states that this will provide around 50% longer recording times when compared to LQ, making it great for longer form projects, such as conferences, documentaries, and interviews. This means RAW and its adjustability parameters are no longer limited to larger file sizes, and gives more users across more formats and genres a greater level of control. Through this update, footage can now also be directly uploaded to Frame.io or Amazon S3. However, a fast internet connection is definitely needed, but it's great to see Komodo embracing these newer cloud-based upload options. The Komodo also receives support for accelerometer and gyro data, which is embedded directly into the R3D files, and this could be really useful for stabilization in post-production. However, this is yet to be implemented. But if it could be harnessed in a similar way as to what Sony does, this could be an excellent feature to have, especially as a Komodo doesn't have any kind of built-in stabilization. There's also the ability to send external audio only over SDI for streaming, new overlay modes with opacity adjustment, enhanced timecode behavior and timecode out, as well as some other small additions and fixes, all of which can be found on RED's firmware download page. So overall, for me, this is a great update for the Komodo, And it's great to see that this little workhorse is getting new features and improvements which make operators' lives easier and quicker on set. Hope this helps. Cheers for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.